Jaehwan realized that this place wasn't the great realm he had been searching for. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard footsteps approaching. Mino rushed over, grabbing him by the collar and demanding to know what he was doing. They were already closing in. She anxiously asked him about the sword he had used earlier, the one he had been feeding, and urged him to use it to kill their enemies. Jaehwan fixed her with a cold stare and calmly responded that he no longer had that sword. He had lent it to someone who was standing watch. Mino's face paled with disbelief. She couldn't fathom how he could hand over a spirit weapon so recklessly, especially just because someone asked. She scolded him for doing something so dangerous. As the Red Fox clan closed in, they thanked Jaehwan for giving them the sword, mocking him as a fool. They boasted that they didn't even need it, they were the Red Fox clan, after all. Mino cursed under her breath, furious that they had dared to challenge her. Jaehwan, watching her reaction, became intrigued. He was curious to finally witness her combat abilities. With their leader's order, the Red Fox clan charged toward them, ready to strike. Mino, undeterred, hurled her daggers with precision, hitting several attackers straight in the head, killing them instantly. She moved swiftly, kicking one of the members square in the face before retrieving her daggers and launching them at the next wave of foes. One by one, they fell to her relentless assault. After clearing most of the clan members, Mino returned to Jaehwan, breathing heavily. She offered a quick apology, saying she hadn't meant to throw the daggers so hard, though her focus never wavered from the remaining enemies. Mino, visibly irritated, retrieved her daggers and pointed them at the remaining Red Fox clan members. Her voice cold, she declared they were about to experience a world of pain. The clan's leader, already suspicious of Mino since she had managed to lure monsters toward them earlier, began to piece things together. His suspicions grew as he considered the possibility that she was none other than the infamous Witch of Destruction. He wondered who in the Black Forest clan had the audacity to send her here. Mino met his gaze and smirked, as if it didn't matter who had sent her. In chaos, people like him were always on someone's hit list, especially since they had no qualms about slaughtering unsuspecting, non-adapted players. Without hesitation, she flung her daggers toward them again, but the Red Fox clan leader just laughed. He was confident that the Black Forest clan wouldn't get involved for someone like her. Wielding the spirit sword he had taken from Jaehwan, he shattered her daggers with ease. With an air of arrogance, he rambled on about how someone must have hired Mino in secret and gloated that she shouldn't bother praying. This was the end of the line for the Witch of Destruction. His taunt only further aggravated Mino, who was annoyed that he thought he could defeat her with just one spirit weapon. The leader grinned, feeling secure in the knowledge that he had additional backup. Mino surveyed the area, quickly counting the number of enemies. There were about 30 or 40 of them, all first-stage adapted players, which explained the heavy footfalls she'd heard earlier. The leader, relishing the moment, pointed out that they weren't just dealing with any ordinary pair, a witch from the Black Forest clan and a man who had killed a two-horned beast with a single strike. He boasted that he had come prepared, asking her if she really thought he would face such formidable opponents without proper reinforcements. The Red Fox clan leader boasted that he hadn't summoned just anyone, he had brought their master. Mino's eyes widened in disbelief as Black Fox Clint, the third-stage adapted player and leader of the Red Fox clan, appeared. She couldn't help but smirk, thinking he must have had a lot of free time lately. Clint, with a devilish grin, wagged his tongue and sarcastically welcomed her, saying she should feel honored by his presence. He informed her that half of the Red Fox clan had come specifically to hunt her down. Mino, masking her surprise, sarcastically responded, "Oh, I'm so honored," knowing full well that Clint clearly wasn't as busy as he liked to pretend. She needed a moment to collect her thoughts. Facing a third-stage adapted player like Clint in a one-on-one fight would be no small feat, and she wasn't sure she could take him down alone. Turning to Jaehwan, she addressed him as Amnesia and Abyss Warrior, which caught him off guard. Regret tinged her voice as she admitted she wouldn't be able to protect him. She tossed him a return stone and urged him to use it to escape. Jaehwan caught the stone, recognizing it as a nightmare stone, but asked her about its purpose. Mino explained that it was a return stone that would take him to the nearest fortress. She only had one, and she needed him to use it now, which left Jaehwan in shock. He was taken aback that this stone could keep someone alive in the present, not send them back in time. His thoughts wandered back to the Nightmare Tower. What would have happened if he'd given Yunawan one of these stones back then? With curiosity overriding the danger of the moment, Jaehwan asked Mino if there was a way to travel back in time. Mino was stunned by his question and, in the midst of the chaos, couldn't believe he'd ask something like that now. But Jaehwan was serious. She shook her head, answering that she'd never want to return to the past after fighting so hard to get where she was. Pointing her blades at the enemies surrounding them, she declared with conviction that even if it meant her death, she would refuse to go back. Jae-hwan placed a hand on her shoulder, stepped forward, and confidently assured her, "You're not going to die today." Without waiting for her response, he drew his sword and charged toward their enemies. Mino stood frozen, shocked and confused by his sudden resolve. In a swift, precise motion, Jae-hwan unleashed a powerful strike, subduing most of the Red Fox clan members in an instant. Furious at the unexpected turn of events, Black Fox Clint growled, ordering his remaining men to use the 14th technique of the Fire King. The battle was far from over. The Red Fox clan members quickly moved into position, preparing to execute the 14th technique of the Fire King. Jae-hwan, unfazed by their formation, activated his third stage of awakening, Oblivion. He abandoned any pretense of the identity this world had assigned him and focused solely on his true power. His eyes locked onto the enemies ahead, and with his sword pointed directly at them, he launched himself forward in a flash. His blade cleaved through them effortlessly, and in moments, he had reached their leader. Black Fox Clint attempted to defend himself, raising his hand in a desperate attempt to stop the strike, but Jae-hwan's sword easily pierced through both the barrier and his body. Blood splattered across the face of the Red Fox group leader as he watched his master fall in stunned silence. Trembling, the leader surrendered the spirit sword to Jae-hwan. With his sword now in hand, Jae-hwan turned to face the remaining members of the Red Fox clan. Panic set in as they tried to flee, but Jae-hwan didn't hesitate. He pointed his blade in their direction and unleashed a shallow stab, sending out a shockwave of energy that obliterated them all in a single blow. Mino stood frozen, disbelief etched on her face. The power Jae-hwan had just displayed was beyond anything she had imagined. She recalled how, not long ago, she had thought him reckless for casually handing over the horns of the two-horned beast to those thugs. Back then, she had written him off as a fool, someone too naive to realize the danger he was in when he gave his spirit sword to the gangsters without a second thought. But now, seeing him in action, she realized just how wrong she had been. Jae-hwan was powerful, his strength wasn't dependent on his spirit weapon at all. Mino, still reeling from the shock, called out to him, her voice shaky as she asked once more about his true identity. Jae-hwan smirked at her question, teasingly asking if she had forgotten. After all, she knew his identity already. Mino's confusion deepened, unsure of what he meant. Jae-hwan, in turn, wondered if she had somehow lost her memory. After all, he thought he was the only one suffering from amnesia. Mino was taken aback by the jab, feeling slighted by his comment. Frustrated, she demanded the return stone she had given him earlier to escape. But to her dismay, Jae-hwan nonchalantly revealed that he had already lost it. Mino's temper flared as she asked if he had any idea how expensive those stones were. Jae-hwan simply shrugged and suggested she look around if she wanted it back that badly. Later, as the night settled in, they sat around the fire. The tension had dissipated, and Jae-hwan leaned back, enjoying the rare moment of peace. For the first time that day, the air was still, and the quiet enveloped them both. While Mino rifled through Jae-hwan's backpack, desperately searching for the return stone, her frustration grew. She cursed herself for trusting a stranger with something so valuable. Meanwhile, Jae-hwan was calmly feeding his spirit sword, and, sensing her frustration, he casually remarked, "How are we strangers? We already know each other." Mino spun around, exasperated. "What do we know about each other? I don't even know who you are," she shot back. Jae-hwan smiled, replying simply, "I'm human." His cryptic answer only annoyed her further. "What are you even talking about?" she demanded. He turned the question back on her, asking, "Aren't you human too?" With an eye roll, Mino affirmed, "Obviously." Jae-hwan clenched his fist, quietly muttering, "That should be enough for us to know." His sudden intensity startled Mino, and she couldn't help but wonder what was going through his head. After a moment of reflection, though, she realized he had a point. Maybe the fact that they were both human was all that mattered. The next day, as they walked, Mino broke the silence, asking if Jae-hwan remembered anything from before he entered Chaos or the Great Realm. He shook his head, confirming that his memories were a blank slate. Her mood darkened as she admitted her envy of his amnesia. Jae-hwan was bewildered by the idea. "You envy losing your memories?" he asked, incredulous. Mino nodded and explained, "Most people here probably envy you. Everyone who ends up in chaos does so for reasons they'd rather forget." Jae-hwan, confused, pressed her on what she meant by obvious reasons and how everyone had arrived in this place. She halted in her tracks, her expression serious. "If you really think about what you just asked, you might regret it," she warned. Their conversation paused as they approached the towering gates of Gorgon Fortress. 2 guards stood watch at the entrance. Mino sighed in relief, happy to have finally reached their destination. She hurried forward, while Jae-hwan hung back, taking in the scene. The area surrounding the fortress was chaotic. The sight before him brought back memories of the first floor of the tutorial. Everywhere he looked, there were people in distress, some were injured, others begged for mercy. One woman clung desperately to her husband, refusing to leave him behind. Faces twisted in pain, prayers for salvation, the air thick with despair. It was a sight Jaehwan had seen far too often before. He turned to Mino, asking, "What is this place?" Mino glanced back at the desperate crowd, a mix of sadness and weariness in her eyes. "You really don't understand what you asked me, do you?" she replied quietly. She warned him once more not to ask anyone there how they ended up in chaos. As Jaehwan stared at the people writhing in agony, coughing up blood, Mino's voice turned somber. "Welcome to the world of dead chaos," she said softly. "For those who survive the nightmare towers, there are usually only two fates left. They're either chosen by the abyssal gods or selected by the masters of the great realm," Mino continued, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Some rise to glory in battle, but most fail and find themselves here, in chaos, the stem of the tree of illusion." Jaehwan frowned, the concept gnawing at him. "So, if someone dies in the great realm, they end up here in chaos?" he asked. Mino nodded solemnly. "Yes, but if you die here, it's final. There's no coming back. You become nothing more than nourishment for the tree of illusion. No blood is spilled because, by then, you're already dead." Jaehwan's unease deepened. He had thought his nightmare was over when he escaped the tower, but now he realized he was trapped among the dead. Mino noticed his troubled expression. "What are you mumbling about?" she asked, though he waved it off. Instead, he focused on what she had said earlier. "Did you say this place is the stem of the tree of illusion?" Mino confirmed, explaining, "What people call nightmare towers are just the roots of the tree. Chaos is the stem, and the abyss forms the branches. All of it belongs to the tree of illusion." Jaehwan's eyes widened at the mention of the tree of illusion. It was the very tree Malak had referenced. Memories of a cryptic message scrawled on one of the tower's floors flooded his mind. The countless towers that Malak had created were merely the roots supporting the original nightmare, which rested at the top of the tree of illusion. A sense of purpose surged through him. Perhaps, despite all his struggles, he wasn't in the wrong place after all. There was still a higher goal for him to pursue. While Jaehwan processed this, the soldiers around them began moving. Their commander barked orders for everyone to form lines and head to the platform. As the crowd shuffled forward, Jaehwan observed the platform, a massive structure looming ominously ahead. Once they reached the platform, the general ordered the captives to don the garments laid out before them and stand in line. As one man lifted his head from beneath the sack, the general paused, looking him over with a critical eye. The man appeared frail and emaciated, his skin stretched thin over his bones. The general, unimpressed, muttered something about how weak he looked. He ordered the man to stand up straight and, with a scoff, asked, "What were you in your past life? A webtoon artist?" Jaehwan couldn't help but notice the irony. It seemed even in this place, the past clung to people like a shadow they couldn't shake off. Miho called out to the general of the soldiers, "James," which took him by surprise. As he turned to face her, confusion crossed his features. "What brings you to the northern checkpoint?" he asked. Miho shrugged casually. "I just happened to be passing through," she replied before quickly shifting the conversation. "You know who I am, right? How about letting me through?" James sighed and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Miho, but things are different now. We've got new orders, everyone entering the fortress has to show a certificate. No exceptions." Miho blinked, taken aback. "Wait, you're talking about those ridiculous certificates my brother implemented, aren't you?" She sighed in frustration, glancing over at Jaehwan, wondering if he had one. "You got a certificate?" she asked. Jaehwan shook his head. "Nope." Seeing no other choice, Miho decided to take a different approach. She stepped closer to James, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Listen, I didn't bring a certificate with me," she admitted, offering him a small, apologetic smile. Then, she reached into her pouch and pulled out something gleaming, a horn. "But maybe this will do instead?" James' eyes widened as she handed him the two-horned beast's horn. He quickly stashed it in his jacket, nodding with a grin. "Fine, you can go ahead. We've known each other long enough, so I'll let it slide this time." Miho chuckled as she breezed past, while James' soldiers exchanged curious glances, astonished by the interaction. James then turned his attention to Jaehwan. "And what about you? Do you have a certificate?" Jaehwan looked at him plainly. "Nope, no certificate." "Is it really that necessary?" Miho raised a brow, flashing a playful smile. "Looks like you're out of luck." She teased him, clearly enjoying the situation. "I could help you, you know, if you ask nicely." But James remained firm. "No certificate, no entry. Those are the rules." Jaehwan understood the seriousness of the situation. He reached into his bag, rummaging for something, unsure of what his next move would be. Mino grew increasingly concerned, her mind racing with thoughts about what Jae-hwan might be planning. Could he really be thinking of killing the guards to get in? The idea seemed absurd, but she couldn't shake it. She recalled times when his decisions had shocked her before. In her imagination, she pictured him pulling out his sword, swiftly taking down the soldiers with a single strike, then casually turning to her and asking, "Aren't you coming?" Maybe he is crazy enough to do something like that, she thought, her anxiety spiking. Not wanting things to escalate, Mino quickly stepped in front of Jae-hwan, pleading with James to hold on for a moment. She tried to explain the situation, but just as she was about to say more, a commotion broke out nearby. They both froze, wondering what was going on. To her shock, a figure was approaching. All the soldiers snapped to attention, saluting the man as he came into view. It was none other than Carlton Javier, the pride of Gorgon Fortress, renowned for his unyielding adherence to the law. As the most upright inspector in all of Chaos, he took his duty very seriously, and his arrival immediately shifted the atmosphere. "James," Carlton said sternly, "mind telling me what's going on here?" After hearing the explanation, Carlton's expression darkened as he realized Jae-hwan was attempting to enter without a certificate. "That's strictly forbidden," he said in a voice that left no room for argument. Jae-hwan, unfazed, asked, "Why?" The simplicity of the question clearly frustrated the inspector. "Because," Carlton said, his voice clipped with irritation, "if your identity cannot be confirmed through proper certification, the law states that entry is prohibited. It's outlined clearly in Article 27, Paragraph 4 of the Gorgon Entry Laws." Mino silently cursed, realizing that Carlton wasn't someone who could be reasoned with easily. Everyone around them dropped to their knees, bound by Inspector Carlton's legal code skill. Even Mino, frustrated, was forced to kneel, caught in the spell's effect. Carlton, standing tall, declared with authority that he had the legal right to detain Jae-hwan under the same law. But Jae-hwan had no intention of complying. With a swift motion, he unsheathed his sword and effortlessly sliced through the chains holding them down. "That's enough," he muttered, yanking Mino up to her feet, leaving everyone, including Carlton, stunned. Jae-hwan's defiance, paired with his strength, made Carlton's eyes widen in disbelief. "I don't care what your silly laws say," Jae-hwan said calmly, sliding his sword back into its sheath. He looked at Carlton and asked flatly, "What exactly does this certificate of yours prove?" Carlton, still in shock, couldn't believe what had just happened. No one had ever broken free of his legal code skill before. How did Jae-hwan do it? Regaining his composure, he explained, "The certificate contains essential information: your real name, institutional affiliations, occupation, primary skills, status, any criminal history, and your spiritual impurity level. It's required for anyone to pass through here." Hearing this, Jae-hwan smirked. "Then I guess I don't need one," he remarked, realizing the certificate was nothing more than a way to pry into his private life, something he had no intention of sharing. Carlton, now visibly frustrated, attempted to use another skill, the silver bond, citing Article 2, Paragraph 7 of the Gorgon Detainment Act. Chains of silver light materialized, snaking toward Jae-hwan to restrain him. But, just like before, the chains shattered the moment they touched him. The soldiers gasped, whispering in disbelief. "He broke Lord Carlton's chains?" someone muttered in shock. Carlton himself was speechless. How could anyone resist both of his signature skills? He stared at Jae-hwan, who seemed completely unfazed by the commotion around him. "Are you not capable of doing what I did?" Jae-hwan asked, looking directly at Carlton with a calm but piercing gaze. His question sent a wave of unease through the crowd. Mino's heart raced as she recalled her earlier bribe to James. She had discreetly handed over a piece of a two-horned beast horn, and the soldiers had all turned a blind eye. Now, with Jae-hwan breaking Carlton's chains effortlessly, she couldn't help but feel her secret was teetering on the edge of discovery. James, who had accepted Mino's earlier bribe, paled, along with the other soldiers. Their faces turned ashen as they witnessed Jae-hwan's bold move. The protagonist reached into his bag, pulling something out while Mino, alarmed, tried to stop him. Ignoring her, Jae-hwan tossed the item to Inspector Carlton. Carlton caught it and examined it curiously. Jae-hwan calmly requested that he accept it in exchange for his entry into the fortress. James, utterly flustered, was furious. "How dare you try to bribe the inspector?" he shouted, assuming Jae-hwan had lost his mind. In his rage, James turned to Carlton, requesting permission to execute Jae-hwan on the spot. However, Carlton raised his hand to stop him. "Wait," the inspector said, turning to Jae-hwan with a knowing look. "Did you say your name was Jae-hwan?" The protagonist nodded, confused but composed. Carlton smiled faintly. "I've been waiting for you," he said, calling Jae-hwan the messenger of Nak Myung. Later, Mino found herself overwhelmed by the truth of what had happened with James. Suddenly, a device touched her head, alerting her that her spirit contamination level had exceeded 15%. A voice urged her to take a recovery pill immediately. Carlton, noticing the change in her, warned, "Your spirit is corrupting. Do you understand what that means?" Mino, clearly upset, nodded furiously. "Of course, I know what it means," she snapped, downing the pill quickly. Jaehwan, genuinely puzzled, asked, "What exactly is spirit contamination?" Mino couldn't believe her ears. She stared at him, dumbfounded. "You seriously don't know?" She was exasperated. Spirit contamination is a chronic condition that everyone in chaos suffers from. Jaehwan's blank look only made her more frustrated. "I can't believe I'm stuck working with a guy like this," she muttered, amazed at his ignorance. As Mino explained, the inhabitants of chaos had their spirits slowly corrupted by the very nature of the place. Once someone's contamination level hit its peak, the consequences could be devastating. That was why the horns of the horned beasts were so incredibly valuable. Mino had just witnessed how excited Inspector Carlton had been when she used one as a bribe. James, now fully composed, saluted Carlton and reported that all the new arrivals had been safely escorted to a nearby village. Mino continued, explaining to Jaehwan that the horn was the only item in chaos capable of temporarily halting spiritual contamination, and thus, everyone desperately sought after them. "Though I got one for free, thanks to a certain someone," she added, popping her recovery pills nonchalantly. Inspector Carlton, still suspicious, informed Jaehwan that he would scan him next. Moving a device close to him, the scanner whirred to life, but after a few moments, it malfunctioned, turning red and sputtering with error codes. Everyone was caught off guard. Carlton inspected the device, which was unable to read Jaehwan's spirit contamination level. The reading came up as 0. The inspector's eyes narrowed, and a knowing smirk spread across his face, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. He handed Jaehwan back his spirit stones, catching him off guard. Jaehwan hadn't expected Carlton to return them so easily. "You shouldn't part with the stones of fallen souls so lightly," Carlton said, his tone knowing. "Especially not as the messenger of Nak Myung." Jaehwan was quick to correct him. "I'm not anyone's messenger. I don't even know who or what Nak Myung is." Carlton gave a slight chuckle. "I know," he said mysteriously, as if there was more to his statement than he let on. After the tense exchange, they finally made their way into the fortress. James, still rattled, turned to Carlton. "Are you really going to let him go just like that?" Carlton responded with a question of his own. "Do you even know what the stones of fallen souls are?" James nodded, replying that they were rare items used by adapted players to boost their mana. "That's true," Carlton confirmed, but then he removed his glove, revealing the hand with which he had touched Jaehwan's spirit stones. "But there's more to them than that." The ominous gesture left James wide-eyed, as if a deeper, more dangerous truth lingered beneath the surface. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next one.